In the years after the arrest of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo in 1989, the border city of Tijuana became the stage for a ruthless struggle for control of one of the most lucrative smuggling corridors into the United States, and the story that unfolded there reads like a study in ambition turned to violence. The Arellano Félix brothers, Benjamin, Ramon, Eduardo and their siblings, moved quickly to carve out dominion over the Tijuana corridor, exploiting the vacuum left by the fragmentation of the Guadalajara Cartel. Their strategy combined centralized command with a willingness to deploy extreme force, employing sicarios to carry out targeted assassinations, kidnappings and bombings aimed at rivals, officials and anyone perceived as a threat to their operations. As they consolidated power, a bitter rivalry with the Sinaloa Cartel, led in part by Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, escalated into open warfare that made streets, neighborhoods and public spaces the scenes of brutal confrontations. Car bombings, public executions and ambushes punctured the false safety of daily life, and the spectacle of violence served both as punishment and as a warning to others who might challenge their control. The consequences radiated outward. Tijuana recorded soaring homicide rates and a civic atmosphere hollowed out by fear, while corruption seeped into municipal institutions as the cartel used bribery and intimidation to secure protection and logistical advantage, undermining police effectiveness and eroding public trust. At the same time, the cartel's control of a major transit route ensured a steady flow of cocaine, heroin, marijuana and later methamphetamine into U.S. markets, exacerbating addiction and crime problems in Southern California and prompting a stepped-up law enforcement response on both sides of the border. International cooperation and intelligence sharing intensified, but so did the cartel's adaptations, compartmentalization of operations, use of professionalized hit squads and investment in smuggling techniques that were harder to intercept, making dismantling the organization a protracted and costly effort. The Mexican state and U.S. agencies eventually struck significant blows. Ramon Arellano Félix was killed in a 2002 confrontation with authorities, Benjamin was captured later that same year, and Eduardo was arrested in 2008, events that fractured the cartel's leadership and diminished its centralized hold. Yet those defeats also produced a different set of consequences, as fragmentation of power created splinter groups and prompted struggles for the remaining territory, prolonging instability in the region. Behind the headlines and arrests were the quieter, enduring harms. The families who lived with the absence or loss of loved ones, neighborhoods marked by demography shifts as residents fled violence, local economies distorted by illicit cash flows and extortion, and a legacy of institutional weakness that complicated governance and public safety for years afterward. The Arellano Félix Organization's period of dominance therefore cannot be described simply as a rise and fall. It must be understood as a disruptive force whose methods and the responses they provoked reshaped criminal networks, law enforcement practices and community life along the border, leaving patterns of violence and corruption that continue to influence the region's security landscape. In each video we dive deep into real-life crime stories, the mysteries and investigations that have shaped history and captivated the world. We focus on the details, the evidence, the timelines, the people. From cold cases that have baffled investigators to infamous crimes that shock nations, we examine each case with the thoroughness it deserves. Crime scenes, forensic evidence, and the detective work that either solved these cases or left them open. If you're ready to uncover chilling cases and learn about the crimes that remain unchanged, subscribe to our channel. My name is Greg and welcome to Unchanged. In the last years of the 1980s, the map of narco-trafficking in northwestern Mexico carried the imprint of geography and commerce more than the doctrine of any single leader. Tijuana occupied a hard-to-ignore advantage, a dense urban zone pressed against an affluent U.S. city, multiple border crossings that funneled trucks and people in both directions, and an economy tied to cross-border flows of labor, goods, and investment. The city's growth since the mid-20th century, spurred by manufacturing plants known as maquiladoras, by tourism and by a daily circulation of workers and shoppers, created a volume of legitimate traffic that, in practical terms, made concealment easier for those moving contraband. That same volume became the primary structural determinant of value, a corridor through which narcotics could be forwarded into vast American markets with relative efficiency. Where demand and access converge, opportunity arrives. Where oversight is thin and institutions are brittle, opportunity can be seized by force. The arrest of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo in 1989 removed a centralizing figure within Mexico's drug trade and redistributed power across a landscape already predisposed to competition. Félix Gallardo's organization, the Guadalajara Cartel, had coordinated a wide network of production, trafficking, and political protection. When that network dissolved under law enforcement pressure, its routes and contacts did not vanish, they became contested assets. The fragmentation that followed did not produce an orderly partition but a scramble. Local operators, regional bosses, and ambitious family networks moved to claim the pieces they believed would be most profitable or defensible. In Tijuana, the Arellano Félix family stepped into that opening. Their rise was not the product of fortune alone, but of how structural conditions made a focused, disciplined, and violent claim on the corridor both feasible and, from their perspective, necessary. To understand the conflict that would unfold, one needs to look beyond personalities to institutional weaknesses. Throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, many municipal police forces in Mexico were chronically underfunded and poorly trained. Patrol salaries lagged behind the purchasing power of illicit proceeds. Those conditions created predictable vulnerabilities. Officers who could be bought, officers who could be threatened, and officers who lacked the resources to investigate networks that extended beyond their precincts. In Tijuana, these realities intersected with political arrangements in which patronage and informal influence were persistent features of governance. The result was a transactional public space in which organized traffickers could secure protection, logistical assistance, or, at minimum, a measure of acquiescence. On the American side of the border, demand for narcotics, cocaine in particular during the 1980s and 1990s, provided the financial motive large enough to drive entrepreneurial violence. Southern California's urban markets, the distribution networks that funneled product inward from the border, and the willingness of criminal enterprises to invest in secure transit all fed a transnational economy. At the same time, enforcement capacity on both sides presented limitations. The sheer scale of legal commerce made inspections selective, and coordination across jurisdictions was uneven in practice. These operational frictions created a window for traffickers to innovate. More sophisticated concealment methods, compartmentalization of operations, and the development of networks that mixed legal commerce with covert channels. Those innovations were not purely technical. They carried a social logic that turned resource control into a political project. The Arellano Félix brothers, a family network with deep ties to the region, pursued a model of centralized command and ruthless enforcement to secure their claims. That model introduced a new dynamic into the local public order. When control is contested by force, the incentives to display lethal capability rise. Violence becomes both an instrument of removal and a form of deterrence. Hit squads, advances in arms procurement, and tactical brutality were not incidental details but strategic choices meant to impose a cost on opposition and potential defectors. In a city where nightlife, commerce, and domestic routines unfolded within blocks of transit routes, those choices converted everyday spaces into stages for public intimidation. Conflict in this setting thus had immediate and visible consequences. The city's homicide rate climbed as rival groups engaged in strikes against each other and against local authorities seen as obstacles. Car bombings, targeted assassinations, and massed ambushes punctured the presumption of safety in neighborhoods that had once been ordinary. These acts of violence functioned on two levels simultaneously. They removed rivals and they signaled to business owners, municipal officials, and residents that resistance would be met with uncompromising force. The social consequence was a climate of fear that reshaped civic behavior. Businesses altered hours or locations, families moved or took smaller economic risks, and local media navigated the dangers of reporting on organized crime. The institutional consequences were equally corrosive. As cartel influence extended, patterns of corruption intensified, not merely isolated bribes but systemic arrangements that compromised investigative capacity, biased prosecutorial priorities, and eroded public trust. When law enforcement becomes enmeshed in protection networks, the public loses a credible mechanism for redress. That loss created two practical effects. First, it constrained civic cooperation with police investigations, reducing the ability to gather evidence and witness testimony. Second, it permitted traffickers to reallocate a portion of their profits into reinforcing operational advantages, better weapons, logistics, and channels to move product across a border that, for all its checkpoints, remained porous to those who knew how to exploit it. Economically, the consequences were paradoxical and damaging. The illicit cash flow entering a city can produce short-term liquidity, investments in real estate, construction, and commerce that superficially appear to stimulate growth. Yet those inflows also distort local markets and create dependencies. Predatory practices such as extortion, protection rackets, and informal taxation of local business introduced a recurring cost that strangled legitimate entrepreneurship. Over time, the kind of uneven development that follows criminalized capital undermines formal economic institutions, reduces investment from credible sources, and channels social energy into ways of surviving predation rather than building resilience. Beyond the municipal level, the situation had international consequences that shaped policy responses. U.S. law enforcement and Mexican authorities increased intelligence sharing, joint operations, and pressure along transit points. Those efforts, while necessary, produced a tactical countermove from trafficking organizations: greater compartmentalization, the professionalization of enforcement cadres within cartels, and diversification into other illicit markets and techniques. The interplay between enforcement and adaptation thus generated a cycle in which short-term victories against specific actors could trigger shifts in organizational structures that complicated long-term suppression efforts. The setting for the conflict: a densely trafficked border city, a fractured criminal landscape, institutional weakness, and robust external demand, therefore made violent competition more likely and its consequences more pervasive. As factions fought for routing, contacts, and the protective relationships that ensured uninterrupted movement, the lived reality for residents was one of recurring shock. Sudden violence in public places, the slow creep of corruption into daily life, and the fragmentation of economic opportunity under the weight of illicit power. Those dynamics did not exist in isolation. They fed into larger patterns of regional insecurity and set the stage for the specific confrontations and leadership struggles that would define the Tijuana Cartel's subsequent chapter. Before the arrests and headline-grabbing shootouts, the structural forces at play had already written much of the script. A corridor of commerce susceptible to exploitation, public institutions strained by inadequate capacity and corruption, and a cross-border demand that made control of the corridor worth contesting by any means necessary. When the pieces of the Guadalajara Cartel were dispersed, the Arellano Félix family did not inherit a ready-made empire so much as a map of opportunities, smuggling points, corruptible officials, and established routes that required control and protection to be profitable. The family's rise in Tijuana followed a purposeful logic: consolidate the corridor, neutralize rivals, and institutionalize a system that blended business-like logistics with ruthless enforcement. At the center of that effort were the Arellano Félix brothers, a tight-knit group whose roles reflected a division of labor: financial oversight and negotiation in some hands, operational command and security in others. That structure allowed them to move with the efficiency of an organization and the brutality of a paramilitary force when deterrence required it. Conflict was the tool they wielded to secure their claims. From the outset, the brothers invested in capacity that went beyond traditional smuggling techniques. They cultivated networks of informants and collaborators inside municipal agencies, port operations, and transportation companies. They built relationships with local gang elements who could provide manpower for street-level control, and they developed a cadre of sicarios who were trained and paid to carry out precision violence. Those hit squads were not spontaneous outbursts of criminal fury but assets to be deployed selectively. An assassination to remove a rival contact, a bombing to intimidate a police unit suspected of cooperation with foes, a kidnapping to leverage information or enforce silence. Violence was therefore both instrumental and symbolic, aimed at gaining tangible advantage and at signaling the cost of resistance. The immediate consequences of that strategy were visible and swift. Control over checkpoints, loading zones, and stash houses allowed the cartel to reduce leakage of shipments, improving profitability. Simultaneously, the spectacle of violence reshaped how markets operated. Intermediaries and transporters who once competed for access now sought the cartel's protection, paying fees or accepting terms that institutionalized a flow of illicit revenue. The cartel's consolidation of the corridor introduced a degree of predictability for their business operations, even as it increased danger for anyone who fell outside or opposed the arrangement. But consolidation bred rivalry. The Sinaloa Cartel, itself a powerful and adaptable organization, contested the Tijuana corridor because the route's value was too great to be ceded without effort. What might have been a series of negotiated settlements instead became a contest in force. The tactical choices made by the Arellano Félix group escalated the conflict. Targeted killings of rival lieutenants, sabotage of shipments, and open ambushes on convoys. Those moves provoked counterattacks and hardened the nature of the rivalry. The consequence was not merely more violence but a transformation in how criminal competition was waged in the region. Warfare between cartels shifted from covert sabotage to public, high-intensity confrontations that could be seen on city streets and reported in local news. The cartel's methods also had institutional consequences. To protect a sprawling operation that relied on cross-border flows, The Arellano Félix Organization invested in bribery and co-optation at multiple levels of government and enforcement. Municipal officers, customs agents, and local politicians were offered incentives to look the other way or to actively assist in smooth passage. Such arrangements yielded short-term stability for smuggling operations. Inspections slackened, prosecutions stalled, and intelligence channels feeding law enforcement were compromised. Yet those short-term gains produced long-term institutional degradation. As public agencies accepted illicit influence, their investigative capacity eroded and public legitimacy diminished. Citizens who sought justice encountered bureaucracies that were less responsive or outright obstructive, and that dynamic reinforced the cartel's ability to operate with reduced interference. On the social front, the cartel's consolidation influenced patterns of mobility and economic behavior. Workers and entrepreneurs who depended on cross-border transactions found themselves negotiating with a shadow power whose demands could take the form of protection payments or violent reprisals. Some sectors adapted by aligning with the cartel's economic logic. Others retreated, relocating their investments or leaving the city altogether. The consequence was a reconfiguration of the urban economy. Visible pockets of wealth tied to illicit profits sat beside neighborhoods experiencing stagnation or decline, and the social fabric of communities, the trust between neighbors and between citizens and public institutions, frayed under the strain of fear and suspicion. International consequences followed a similar pattern. The cartel's tighter control over the corridor meant that a greater portion of narcotics moving into the United States had a single, organized source, which in turn affected the structure of US-based distribution and enforcement. American law enforcement agencies took notice, and cooperation with Mexican counterparts increased in intensity and frequency. But the cartel's response was to adapt. They diversified smuggling techniques, invested in counterintelligence to detect informants, and used violence selectively to disrupt cooperative efforts between agencies. That adaptation prolonged the conflict and complicated enforcement strategies, creating a cycle in which targeted pressure produced tactical shifts rather than decisive collapse. Internally, the cartel's consolidation did not eliminate internal tensions. As operations grew, so did the stakes for leadership and control. Disputes over revenue shares, distribution of risk, and the appropriate level of violence produced friction points that required management. The Arellano Félix leadership attempted to centralize decision-making to avoid fragmentation, yet the fluid nature of illicit markets and the external pressure of enemies and law enforcement meant that perfect cohesion was impossible. The consequence of imperfect control manifested in episodes of betrayal, defections, and targeted eliminations within the organization, dynamics that made the cartel simultaneously powerful and vulnerable. By the time Mexican and U.S. authorities began to mount more aggressive, coordinated efforts to dismantle the cartel's leadership, the organization's consolidation had already produced enduring effects. Smuggling routes had been mapped and institutionalized, corruption networks had been established, and violence had normalized a method of conflict resolution in the streets and institutions of Tijuana. The arrests and killings of key figures would later fragment centralized control, but they would not simply revert the city to its prior state. Instead, the consequences of the cartel's formation persisted. New actors filled vacuums, enforcement agencies adapted their practices, and communities continued to live under the weight of a criminal order that had been, for a time, as structured as it was brutal. Once control of the corridor was at stake, the contest moved from transactions to tactics, and tactics quickly became violence writ large across public life. The Arellano Félix Organization did not rely solely on clandestine smuggling. It invested in an apparatus designed to impose order through fear. That apparatus included professionalized sicarios, contracted hitmen organized into cells with clear chains of command, whose missions ranged from targeted assassinations of rival lieutenants to high-profile attacks intended to broadcast capability and resolve. Kidnappings served multiple purposes: extracting information, enforcing silence, and signaling to potential collaborators that cooperation with rivals carried risk. Bombings and arson, though less frequent, were employed as instruments of spectacle, devices meant to puncture complacency and make municipal authorities and citizens alike aware of who could and would strike without warning. Conflict with the Sinaloa Cartel crystallized these tactics into sustained, reciprocal campaigns. The Sinaloa Group, under leaders who would include Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, sought access to Tijuana's lucrative passages because control of a stable route simplified distribution networks into the United States. Where negotiations failed or were insufficient, both sides resorted to escalating violence. Ambushes on convoys, assassinations of mid-level operatives who brokered deals, and assaults aimed at infrastructure, warehouses, safe houses, even the residences of suspected collaborators. Public spaces became theaters of intimidation. A street once traversed by commuters and market vendors could be transformed by a single targeted attack into a sealed-off crime scene, and the image of open-air violence became a tool for shaping public perception of power. The immediate consequence of this tactical posture was a dramatic shift in the experience of urban life. Residents encountered violence not only as discrete criminal incidents but as an ambient threat that altered routine behavior. Schools, markets, and transportation nodes operated under new calculations of risk. Businesses adjusted hours or shuttered entirely. Families moved to perceived safer neighborhoods or left the city. Informal networks of mutual aid and rumor substituted for reliable channels of civic support. For journalists and civil society actors, covering cartel activity carried heightened personal risk, which in turn limited public information and constrained civic debate about policy responses. Institutionally, the cartel's tactics strained and reshaped law enforcement responses. Police units on the municipal level found themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered. Local forces lacked the intelligence capacity and tactical training to confront well-armed cells operating with cross-border reach. The consequence was a turn toward defensive postures, relying on checkpoints, raids of known stash sites, and, at times, withdrawal from proactive policing in neighborhoods perceived as cartel strongholds. Where municipal forces proved inadequate, federal and specialized units stepped in, but the transition was neither seamless nor uniformly effective. Coordination problems, jurisdictional friction, and, crucially, embedded corruption hampered operations, and in some cases, attempts to clamp down produced violent retaliation designed to demonstrate that the costs of intervention would be steep. The cartel's tactical choices also had ripple effects across criminal markets. By raising the operational stakes, they incentivized professionalization, better procurement of weapons, investment in surveillance to detect informants, and tighter operational security. This, in turn, made the organizations more resilient and harder to penetrate, but it also increased the destructiveness of confrontations. When rival groups met in pitched clashes, the weaponry and tactics available produced greater lethality and collateral harm. The consequence was a widening demographic of victims. Not only rival operatives but security personnel, bystanders, and local business owners who became caught in crossfire or targeted for reprisals when suspected of cooperation. At the international level, visible escalation prompted shifts in policy and practice. U.S. agencies increased joint investigations and intelligence sharing initiatives with Mexican counterparts. Cross-border task forces and extradition requests became more central to strategy. Those measures aimed to choke supply lines and remove key leaders from the field. The consequence on cartel behavior was adaptive. Organizations compartmentalized their networks to reduce the damage from individual arrests, shifted routes and methods to exploit new vulnerabilities, and sometimes diversified into other illicit markets to hedge risk. The interplay between enforcement pressure and organizational adaptation meant that tactical confrontations produced cyclical rather than terminal outcomes. Operations could dismantle cells or seize shipments, but the underlying incentives and capacities that sustained trafficking persisted. Importantly, the conflict's tactical dimension generated social and psychological consequences that were less visible but equally consequential. The normalization of public displays of violence eroded trust in the future. Investment horizons shortened, social institutions became more brittle, and the trauma of repeated exposure to violence affected daily decision-making. Children grew up with different baselines for what constituted danger. Communal rituals of public life, festivals, markets, neighborhood gatherings shrank or moved indoors. Those shifts mattered because they reduced civic resilience and made collective action against criminal influence more difficult. Finally, the sustained campaign of violence produced feedback loops that shaped the cartel's internal dynamics. Brutal tactics could secure territory temporarily, but they also generated enemies and pressure points, defectors, betrayed associates, and rival factions seeking advantage. Such internal friction sometimes precipitated purges and internal killings, which further intensified the cycle of violence. The consequence was a paradox. The very methods the Arellano Félix Organization used to consolidate power also seeded vulnerabilities that, under sustained law enforcement pressure and rival aggression, would contribute to its eventual fragmentation. Taken together, the tactics deployed during this period of intense rivalry did more than mark moments of criminal theater. They altered the architecture of daily life, governance, and criminal organization in Tijuana. Each violent act had an immediate kinetic consequence: deaths, seizures, disrupted shipments, and a longer tail: institutional erosion, adaptive criminal innovation, and social trauma that complicated recovery. As the conflict unfolded, it became clear that the contest for control of a corridor was not merely a business dispute but a force capable of reshaping a city's institutions, economy, and social fabric. As the tactics of contestation moved into full force, the consequences radiated through everyday life in ways that were immediate and enduring. The most visible outcome was an increase in lethal violence that altered the city's risk landscape. Ambushes, targeted killings, and public attacks produced a steady stream of deaths and injuries that burdened hospitals, overwhelmed morgues, and turned streets into scenes of investigation and grief. For families and neighborhoods, the loss was not limited to individual tragedies. It reshaped household decisions: where to live, whether to send children to certain schools, and how to earn a living without drawing attention. Markets that once thrived on cross-border commerce felt the pressure as vendors and customers recalibrated their routines to avoid areas associated with confrontations. And some small business owners chose to close rather than to negotiate with extortionists or to expose employees to danger. A second set of consequences affected civic institutions. Local police forces, already constrained by budgets and training deficits, faced an existential dilemma: resist and risk lethal retaliation, or cooperate and erode the very rule of law they were sworn to uphold. The result was a spectrum of outcomes. Some officers attempted reforms, others accepted bribes or protection arrangements, and a number became targets themselves. This compromised public confidence in policing, making community cooperation with investigations more fraught and decreasing the flow of reliable witness testimony. Prosecutorial and judicial processes suffered in parallel. Cases that touched cartel interests frequently stalled, evidence went missing, and prosecutors faced threats that constrained the vigor of their work. The consequence was a feedback loop. Weakened enforcement breeds greater impunity, and impunity in turn incentivizes further criminal boldness. Economic consequences were paradoxical and uneven. Inflowing illicit funds created visible signs of wealth: properties, businesses, and consumption patterns that suggested prosperity. Yet those gains were unevenly distributed and accompanied by predatory practices such as extortion and protection rackets that extracted recurring rents from legitimate enterprises, raising operating costs and deterring outside investment. Formal economic actors, manufacturers, exporters, and financial institutions, found themselves navigating a landscape where legitimate commerce could be targeted for coercion, and some relocated to avoid that exposure. Over time, the presence of a violent, shadow economy changed municipal development trajectories. Infrastructure and public services suffered as resources were redirected or as businesses withheld investment amid security concerns. Social and psychological consequences were subtler but no less consequential. The normalization of public displays of force eroded a baseline sense of safety. Children grew up with a different frame of reference for risk. Everyday sounds and scenes, sirens, police cordons, columns of tactical vehicles, became part of the environment. Community rituals and public gatherings retracted as people avoided spaces perceived as risky, weakening the social ties that sustain collective resilience. For survivors and families of victims, trauma accumulated and often went untreated, compounding the human cost and impeding long-term recovery. The media landscape also bore the consequences of the conflict. Journalists and outlets that covered cartel activity faced threats, intimidation, and in many cases, lethal reprisals. Self-censorship increased as reporters weighed the risks of investigative work against the need to stay alive. Some outlets removed bylines or limited coverage. The consequence was a thinning of public information, less investigative reporting, fewer verified accounts of abuses, and a public conversation about security that was shaped as much by rumor as by substantiated fact. That information gap made informed civic responses and public oversight of security policy more difficult. At the institutional level beyond municipal boundaries, the contest prompted shifts in law enforcement strategy. Federal authorities and international partners stepped up operations, bringing specialized units, intelligence assets, and diplomatic pressure into play. Cross-border cooperation with U.S. agencies intensified, focusing on intelligence sharing, extradition, and targeting financial flows. These interventions produced tactical successes, seizures, arrests, and disruptions, but they also had consequences of their own. The increased pressure accelerated the cartel's tendencies to compartmentalize operations, to adopt more secure communication methods, and to delegate risk to lower-level operatives, making the organizations harder to dismantle through leadership decapitation alone. Moreover, the scale of the violence and the limits of policing capacity contributed to a turn toward militarized approaches in some periods, as federal deployments and security operations increased. Those deployments achieved some security objectives but also raised concerns about human rights, accountability, and the long-term effectiveness of force-centric strategies in addressing the root causes of trafficking and corruption. Internationally, consequences flowed northward. The Tijuana corridor sustained throughput of narcotics linked directly to patterns of addiction, distribution networks, and violent crime in U.S. cities, especially in Southern California. U.S. law enforcement's focus on supply interdiction and extradition grew, and policy debates intensified around border security, demand reduction, and the criminal justice response. The consequence was a tightening of cross-border investigative networks and an expansion of bilateral initiatives, moves that helped in some prosecutions but did not, on their own, resolve the structural incentives that made trafficking lucrative. Perhaps the most consequential and least visible outcome was institutional erosion that persisted after headline arrests. When cartel influence infiltrates public institutions, courts, police, municipal administrations, the process of rebuilding trust and capacity is lengthy. Arresting leaders disrupted chains of command, but it did not instantly restore public confidence or repair corrupted channels of governance. Instead, fragmentation often followed, with smaller groups vying for remnants of territory and revenue, producing localized violence and a diffusion of criminal authority that complicated both law enforcement and community recovery. Finally, the human legacy endured in ways statistics cannot fully capture. Families bore not only the immediate loss of life but the ongoing burdens of displacement, disrupted education, and economic precarity. Community organizations and victims groups formed to provide support and to seek justice, but they often worked against a backdrop of constrained resources and persistent insecurity. The consequence is a region marked by resilience and by scars. Communities striving to rebuild civic life even as patterns of violence and corruption exert lingering influence over governance, economics, and public safety. These consequences, social fragmentation, institutional weakening, economic distortion, media constraint, and international spillover, were not incidental fallout but direct outcomes of the conflict's tactics. Each aggressive move to secure route or territory produced a chain of responses and adjustments that shaped the city's institutions and the daily lives of its residents, leaving a complex legacy that law enforcement and civil society would confront for years to come. The struggle for dominance in Tijuana did not remain a local quarrel. It fed directly into a transnational economy whose consequences were felt in streets, courts, and hospitals across the United States. As the Arellano Félix Organization tightened control over a major transit corridor, the immediate conflict objective was simple: secure reliable routes and reduce losses. That tactical gain in Mexico translated into a steadier supply of narcotics into U.S. distribution networks, amplifying availability in market zones already primed by demand. Cocaine shipments that had once been fragmented now moved with greater predictability. Heroin and marijuana continued to flow, and later, methamphetamine production and distribution adapted to exploit new market opportunities. The consequence was not merely higher volume at the border but a reconfiguration of distribution chains inside the United States. Territorial arrangements among U.S. gangs and dealers hardened around more reliable supply lines, and enforcement priorities shifted toward intercepting larger, more sophisticated shipments rather than isolated street-level sales. On the social side of the border, communities in Southern California and other receiving regions experienced the consequences in ways that were both direct and structural. Increased availability of drugs meant larger user populations, higher addiction rates in certain communities, and the attendant social costs. Family dislocation, increased healthcare burdens, and spikes in property crime linked to substance dependence. Law enforcement agencies at municipal and county levels found themselves compelled to redirect resources toward narcotics investigations, drug treatment initiatives, and interagency task forces. The consequence was a reallocation of public spending and attention toward criminal justice responses that emphasized interdiction and prosecution, even as questions mounted about the sufficiency of prevention and treatment options to address growing dependence. Law enforcement and policy responses evolved in step with the cartel's operational choices. U.S. agencies, federal, state, and local, expanded cross-border collaboration with Mexican counterparts, increasing intelligence sharing, coordinated investigations, and operational partnerships designed to target supply chains rather than only low-level distributors. The Drug Enforcement Administration, the FBI, and border-focused units put greater emphasis on financial investigations and asset seizures to disrupt the cartel's economic base. The consequence of these strategic adjustments was twofold. They yielded tactical successes, seizures, arrests, and the dismantling of some trafficking cells, but they also provoked adaptive responses from criminal organizations, which grew more compartmentalized, developed secure communications, and diversified revenue streams to reduce vulnerability to leader-centric crackdowns. Policy debates in the United States reflected the broader consequences of the Tijuana conflict. Border security became a prominent political issue, prompting investments in inspection technology, personnel, and sometimes hardline rhetoric about sealing transit points. At the same time, elected officials and policymakers faced pressure to address demand-side factors, expanding treatment capacity, funding prevention programs, and reconsidering sentencing priorities, because enforcement alone was not reducing consumption. The consequence of this policy mix was uneven. Some jurisdictions increased funding for public health interventions, while others doubled down on enforcement, producing a patchwork of responses that rarely aligned seamlessly across regions. Financially, the cartel's operations created consequences in the form of money laundering networks and distortion of legitimate markets. Illicit profits flowed into both U.S. and Mexican economies through cash-intensive businesses, real estate purchases, and informal channels that sought to integrate dirty money into legitimate financial systems. U.S. financial institutions, prosecutors, and regulators responded with enhanced anti-money laundering efforts and asset forfeiture actions. But the consequence was a persistent cat-and-mouse dynamic. Traffickers adapted by using smaller transactions, alternative remittance channels, and front companies to hide proceeds, complicating enforcement efforts. The cross-border conflict also had human consequences that extended beyond addiction and crime statistics. Families with transnational ties experienced unique pressures. Relatives in Mexico faced direct violence and extortion, while kin in the United States confronted social stigma, the logistics of supporting displaced family members, or the legal ramifications when relatives were implicated in trafficking networks. Community organizations and advocacy groups in border regions worked to fill gaps, providing services, advocating for victims, and pressing for more holistic policies, but they often did so with limited resources against a backdrop of entrenched criminal economies. Finally, the broader consequence of the cartel's sustained activity was a recalibration of the region's security landscape. The pattern of concentrated control followed by violent contestation produced recurring cycles of enforcement and adaptation that hardened the operational sophistication of transnational trafficking networks. Short-term tactical successes by law enforcement, while sometimes dramatic, frequently led to organizational changes that preserved the core incentive structure of trafficking: high demand, high profit, and porous transit opportunities. That dynamic underscored a critical lesson of the period. Disrupting supply in one corridor often redistributed activity rather than eliminating it, producing ripple effects throughout the hemisphere that required coordinated public health, economic, and security responses to address the root causes and consequences of the trade. When Mexican and U.S. authorities intensified coordinated pressure in the early 2000s, the confrontation shifted from pitched battles between cartels to a targeted campaign against the Arellano Félix leadership itself. Law enforcement operations, informed by shared intelligence and sustained investigations into financial networks, safe houses, and smuggling chains, focused on dismantling the organizational core that had enabled the cartel's concentrated control of the Tijuana corridor. Those efforts produced hard, visible blows. Ramon Arellano Félix was killed in a confrontation with authorities in 2002, Benjamin Arellano Félix was captured that same year, and subsequent operations culminated in Eduardo Arellano Félix's arrest in 2008. Each removal of a senior figure represented an operational success, a tactical victory meant to degrade command and control and to fracture the organizational capacity that had allowed the cartel to run so openly for so long. The conflict inherent in this crackdown took several forms. On one level, it was kinetic: raids, arrests, and lethal engagements designed to break the cartel's chain of command. On another, it was strategic: legal pressure through indictments, asset seizures, and cross-border investigations intended to choke financial flows and to make leadership roles materially riskier. The mix of tactics aimed to reduce the cartel's ability to coordinate large-scale smuggling and to deter would-be successors by demonstrating the reach and resolve of state institutions on both sides of the border. The immediate consequence was the disruption of established operational routines. Routes were compromised, caches and contacts exposed, and a centralized managerial approach to trafficking was undermined. But consequences of leadership decapitation are rarely straightforward or final. Removing dominant figures created gaps that rival organizations, local commanders, and opportunistic splinter groups sought to fill. The centralized hold the Arellano Félix brothers had exerted over the corridor weakened, yet that weakening did not produce peace. Instead, territory, loyalties, and revenue streams became contested in new ways. The consequence was a fragmentation of power. Smaller cells, some formerly subordinate, carved out autonomous operations. Others aligned with external cartels or local criminal networks. This diffusion of authority frequently translated into localized conflicts, unpredictable patterns of violence, and a diffusion of criminal responsibility that made it harder for law enforcement to target single points of failure. Institutionally, the crackdown produced mixed outcomes. On the positive side, the arrests and targeted operations validated the effectiveness of bilateral cooperation and showed that senior figures could be located, arrested, or neutralized. Those victories bolstered specialized investigative units and strengthened some prosecutorial efforts. Yet the consequence of these successes also exposed deeper systemic weaknesses. Corruption networks and compromised channels did not vanish with individual arrests. They often persisted in attenuated forms, complicating prosecutions and slowing institutional reform. In some places, the dismantling of a predominant cartel simply shifted corrupt relationships from one set of actors to another, perpetuating the erosion of trust between citizens and public institutions. Economically and socially, the turning point produced dislocations that compounded earlier harms. With the cartel's centralized revenue streams disrupted, extortion and protection schemes sometimes intensified as fragmented groups sought quick cash to sustain operations, leading to increased pressure on local businesses and communities. Populations displaced by earlier waves of violence often found return uncertain as the security landscape remained unstable. Economic recovery was uneven and contingent on the capacity of local governance to restore rule of law and investor confidence. The consequence was a prolonged period of recovery in which communities continued to pay the price for both the cartel's prior dominance and the turbulence that followed its weakening. At the criminal justice level, prosecutions and incarcerations of high-level figures carried their own cascades of consequence. Trials, extraditions, and incarceration removed key operators from the streets but also produced legal and logistical challenges, gathering admissible evidence, protecting witnesses, and preventing assets from being funneled to remaining operatives. The consequence was that dismantling a leadership network required not only arrests but sustained institutional capacity to prosecute, to isolate financial networks, and to protect the civic infrastructure that supports long-term rule of law. Finally, the turning point made clear an enduring lesson of the conflict-consequence dynamic. Tactical victories against specific actors do not, by themselves, resolve the structural incentives that give rise to trafficking and violent competition. Disrupting a cartel's leadership reduced its centralized capacity, but it also reshaped the field in ways that demanded comprehensive responses, strengthening institutions, reducing corruption, expanding economic opportunity, and addressing cross-border demand. The immediate law enforcement successes of the early 2000s thus carried both relief and risk. Relief in the form of diminished centralized brutality and risk in the form of fragmentation, adaptation, and the potential for new waves of instability. In the years that followed, the legacy of those turning point operations would be measured not only by the men taken off the streets but by whether institutions and communities could translate tactical wins into durable reductions in violence and criminal capacity. If this story moved you, don't let it end with the screen. Tell us what struck you most in the comments below. Share an episode of this series with someone who cares about crime, policy, or human rights. Conversations are where pressure for real change begins. If you want more deep dives like this, subscribe and hit the bell so you won't miss the next episode tracing who filled the void after the Arellano Félix era and how communities rebuilt, or didn't, under new pressures. Beyond the channel, consider what consequences you can act on. Support nonprofits working with victims of organized crime and displaced families. Push for local policy that prioritizes treatment and prevention over pure punishment, and encourage elected officials to fund cross-border cooperation that pairs enforcement with social programs. If you're a researcher, journalist, or witness with documents or first-hand accounts, reach out. Your testimony can help build cases, inform reporting, and protect communities. Finally, if there's an angle you want explored, legal cases, survivor stories, or the cartel's financial networks, leave a note below. Your feedback shapes which threads we pull next and how we hold the narrative accountable to the people who lived it.